The dust came first, a slow, rolling cloud that blurred the edge of town like a dirty veil. Then came the sound, boots dragging through gravel, uneven and desperate. The people of Ash Hollow turned their heads toward the noise, shielding their eyes from the late afternoon glare. A woman staggered into view. Her dress was torn at the hem, caked with dirt that looked days old. Her hair hung in tangled ropes across her face. She moved like someone who'd forgotten how to walk properly, each step a negotiation between will and collapse. She made it to the church steps before her knees buckled. The sound of her body hitting the wood echoed across the square. Hands slapped against the weathered planks as she tried to catch herself, but gravity won. She crumpled there, chest heaving, dust rising around her like smoke. People moved closer. Cautious. Curious. Jonas Creed was crossing the street when he heard the commotion. He'd been carrying a bundle of fresh-cut pine from the mill, wood shavings still clinging to his sleeves. He dropped the lumber without thinking and broke into a run. By the time he reached her, a small crowd had formed, farmers, shopkeepers, the blacksmith's wife. They stood in a loose circle, whispering behind their hands, but no one moved to help. Jonas knelt down, reaching out. Her head snapped up. "Do not touch me." The words came out raw, strangled. Her eyes were wild, darting from face to face like a cornered animal searching for an exit that didn't exist. Jonas froze, hands suspended in the air between them. "It's forbidden," she whispered, voice cracking. "Please. Don't." The crowd stirred. Someone muttered the word curse under their breath. Another voice suggested fever. A woman in the back made the sign of the cross. Jonas stayed where he was, crouched low, hands now resting on his own knees. He studied her face, not with pity, but with something closer to recognition. He'd seen fear before. Real fear. The kind that doesn't come from illness or superstition. The kind that comes from men. Boots struck the boardwalk with heavy, deliberate thuds. The crowd parted without needing to be asked. Sheriff Burton Lyle stepped through, thumbs hooked into his belt, badge catching the dying sunlight. He moved with the kind of confidence that didn't need to be earned, just worn like a coat. "Step back, Jonas." It wasn't a suggestion. Jonas glanced up but didn't move. Lyle's jaw tightened. "I said step back. This woman needs protective custody." The words sounded official enough, but something about the way he said them, too quick, too smooth, made Jonas' stomach turn. And when Maeve's eyes locked onto the sheriff, the fear in them doubled. She flinched. It was subtle. Just a slight pulling away, a tightening of her shoulders. But Jonas saw it. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Lyle reached down toward her. "Don't." Jonas stood, placing himself between them. Not aggressive. Just a present. "Give her a moment." The sheriff's face darkened. "Are you questioning my authority, Creed?" "I'm questioning your rush." The two men stood there, locked in something that wasn't quite a standoff but felt like one. The crowd watched, silent now, tension thick enough to choke on. Maeve's voice cut through it all. "Water. Please. Just, water." Jonas nodded once and turned toward the nearby trough. He filled his cupped hands, careful not to spill, and returned. He knelt again, offering it without reaching for her, letting her come to him. She drank. Hands shaking. Eyes never leaving his face. "Thank you," she breathed. And then, quieter, almost to herself, "They told me if anyone laid a hand on me, they'd be marked next." The whispers started again. Witchcraft. Sickness. Curse. But Jonas heard something else entirely. He heard a lie designed to keep someone isolated. And he decided, right there in the dust and heat, that he wasn't going anywhere. Ash Hollow wasn't the kind of town that appeared on many maps. It existed in that forgotten stretch of territory where the land turned harsh and unforgiving, where settlements clung to survival like barnacles to driftwood. The buildings leaned slightly, as if tired of standing upright. Paint peeled from shutters that hadn't been replaced in years. The church bell hadn't rung in so long that birds nested in its hollow crown. Heat shimmered above the dirt roads, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. When the wind blew, and it always blew, it carried dust that got into everything, your eyes, your throat, the cracks in your floorboards. People learned to live with grit between their teeth. The town square was nothing grand. A few shops, a general store with a sagging porch, the sheriff's office with bars on the windows that had rusted orange years ago. The church stood at the north end, its white paint long since surrendered to gray. Its steps, where Maeve now lay trembling, had been worn smooth by generations of boots. Folks gathered in clusters, keeping their distance but unable to look away. The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron, leaving dark smears. The schoolteacher stood in her doorway, one hand pressed to her chest. Old Samuel, who ran the livery, squinted through the dust and shook his head slowly. They all knew Jonas Creed. He was the man you called when your fence posts rotted through, when your barn door wouldn't close right, when something needed fixing and you didn't want a lot of talk while it got done. He'd lived in Ash Hollow for nearly 8 years, kept to himself mostly, worked with his hands and rarely raised his voice above a conversational murmur. People respected quiet men in towns like this. Loud men were trouble. Quiet men were dependable. Jonas had calloused palms and sawdust perpetually caught in the cuffs of his shirts. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than 35. He had the kind of face that didn't draw attention, average features, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a day or two, eyes that watched more than they judged. He lived in a small house at the edge of town, built it himself from timber he'd milled with his own hands. No wife. No family that anyone knew of. Just Jonas and his tools and the sound of hammering that drifted through Ash Hollow most mornings before the heat became unbearable. Now he stood between the collapsed woman and Sheriff Lyle, and the entire town watched to see what would happen next. Lyle's face had gone tight. His hand rested on his belt, fingers drumming against the leather in a rhythm that suggested impatience barely held in check. He was a thick-set man, broad through the shoulders, with a mustache he kept trimmed and oiled. He'd been sheriff for 3 years, appointed by the territorial governor after the last one died of pneumonia. People followed his orders because that was what you did with lawmen. You didn't ask too many questions. You didn't look too closely at the paperwork. You trusted the badge because without it, there was only chaos. But something felt wrong today. The way Lyle had moved through the crowd, too fast, too certain. The way he'd said, protective custody, like he'd been rehearsing it. The way Maeve had flinched when she saw him, that full-body recoil that spoke of recognition. Jonas saw it. Others in the crowd saw it too, though most wouldn't admit it yet. The wind picked up, sending a spiral of dust across the square. It passed between the two men like a warning, like the town itself was holding its breath. Maeve lifted her head slightly, dirt streaked across her cheek. "Please," she said again, voice barely audible. "Just let me rest. Don't let him take me." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff Lyle's jaw clenched. And Jonas Creed planted his feet a little wider in the dust. Jonas didn't look like much at that moment, just a carpenter in a dusty shirt, standing in the middle of a town square with his hands loose at his sides. But there was something in the way he held himself, a kind of stubborn stillness, that made Sheriff Lyle pause. "She asked to rest," Jonas said quietly. "Let her rest." Lyle's eyes narrowed. "You're interfering with the law, Creed. I'm standing in a public square. That's not illegal yet." The crowd murmured. A few people shifted their weight, glancing at each other. This wasn't how things usually went in Ash Hollow. You didn't stand up to the sheriff. You nodded, you agreed, you went about your business. But Jonas had never been much for following the usual way of things when the usual way didn't sit right. He'd learned that the hard way, years ago, in a different town with different problems. He'd learned that sometimes the biggest mistakes came from staying quiet when you should have spoken. From trusting authority just because it wore a badge. From assuming that men in power always had good intentions. He'd left that town with nothing but the clothes on his back and a promise to himself that he'd never make that mistake again. Now he looked at Maeve, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd been running from something worse than hunger or weather. The kind of running that hollowed you out from the inside. "Mrs. Patterson," Jonas called out, keeping his eyes on Lyle. "Could you bring a blanket from the schoolhouse?" The teacher hesitated, then nodded and hurried off. Her willingness to help seemed to give others permission. The blacksmith's wife disappeared into the general store and emerged with a cup of water. Old Samuel shuffled forward with a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. Small acts. Ordinary kindness. But each one was a choice that didn't align with the sheriff's version of events. Lyle's face darkened further. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Jonas said. "But it'll be mine to make." The sheriff took a step forward, hand moving toward the gun at his hip, not drawing it, just touching it, a reminder of where the real power was supposed to lie. Maeve's voice cut through the tension. "He's one of them." Everyone froze. She was sitting up now, barely, supported by her own trembling arms. Her eyes were fixed on Lyle with an intensity that made several people step back. "One of them?" Jonas asked, not breaking eye contact with the sheriff. "The ones who run the covenant." His brother leads it. He knows. He's always known." Lyle's expression shifted, just for a second, just a flicker, and Jonas saw it. The mask slipped. Beneath the authority, beneath the confidence, there was something else. Calculation. Worry. Guilt. "She's clearly unwell," Lyle said, addressing the crowd now instead of Jonas. "Delusional. Probably fevered. She needs medical attention and isolation until we can determine." "Determine what?" Jonas interrupted. "What is she guilty of? What disease does she carry? Or just how to keep her quiet?" The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Mrs. Patterson returned with the blanket and draped it carefully over Maeve's shoulders, avoiding direct contact but offering warmth. Maeve clutched it with shaking hands, pulling it tight around herself like armor. "Thank you," she whispered. Lyle looked around at the assembled townsfolk, at the way they were watching him now, not with automatic deference, but with questions forming behind their eyes. He wasn't stupid. He knew when to retreat and regroup. "Fine," he said, voice hard. "But she stays in town. And if anything happens, any sickness, any trouble, it's on your head, Creed." He turned and walked away, boots striking the boardwalk with heavy, angry thuds. Jonas watched him go, then knelt down beside Maeve again. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. She nodded, and with Mrs. Patterson's help, still careful not to touch skin to skin, they got her to her feet. "The schoolhouse," Jonas said. "It's empty this time of day. You can rest there." Maeve looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Why are you helping me?" Jonas considered the question. "Because someone should have helped you a long time ago," he said. "And didn't." They settled Maeve in the back room of the schoolhouse, where Mrs. Patterson kept supplies and a small cot for when children fell ill during lessons. The teacher brought fresh water and left quietly, sensing that the woman needed space more than company. Jonas stood in the doorway, not entering, not leaving. Just a present. "You should go," Maeve said, staring at the wall. "Being near me will only bring you trouble. I've had trouble before. I'm still here." She turned her head slightly, studying him with exhausted eyes. You don't understand what they're capable of. Then tell me. But she didn't. Not yet. She just pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. Jonas left her to rest, but he didn't go far. He found a broken window frame in the main schoolroom, cracked from last winter's freeze, and set about repairing it. The work was familiar, meditative. Measure twice, cut once. Sand the rough edges. Fit the pieces together until they hold. While he worked, people came by. Some were curious, wanting to know what had happened in the square. Others were concerned, asking if the woman was contagious, if they should keep their children home. A few were angry, suggesting that Jonas had overstepped, that he'd made an enemy of the sheriff for no good reason. He listened to all of them and said very little in return. By evening, the rumors had already started to spread like wildfire through dry grass. Some said Maeve carried a plague from the territories. Others whispered about witchcraft, about curses passed through touch, about women who'd made pacts with dark forces. The more religious among them quoted scripture they only half remembered, passages about unclean vessels and spiritual contamination. Jonas recognized the pattern. Fear looking for a shape to take. People needed explanations for things that frightened them, and when they didn't have real answers, they invented ones. He'd seen it before. Different towns, different circumstances, same human nature. The next morning, he returned to the schoolhouse with lumber for a new shelf Mrs. Patterson had mentioned needing. Maeve was awake, sitting on the cot with her knees drawn up, watching the door like she expected it to burst open at any moment. "You came back," she said. "Said I would." He worked quietly while she watched. After an hour, she spoke. "There's a place. 2 days' ride north. They call it the Covenant of the Pure Word." Jonas kept sanding the board in his hands, letting her set the pace. "It started as a church. A man named Silas Lyle, the sheriff's brother, he preaches there. At first, it seemed normal. Strict, but normal. Then it changed. He started teaching that women were vessels. That we carried either purity or corruption, and only the elders could determine which. Only they could sanctify us through their rituals." Her voice went quiet. Jonas stopped working, set down his tools, but stayed where he was across the room. "I refused one of the rituals. They said I was prideful. That I'd contaminated myself through disobedience. They marked me as forbidden, told everyone that my touch would spread corruption, that anyone who helped me would be marked too. It's a lie, but it's a powerful one. It keeps people isolated. Keep them from running, from helping each other." "How'd you get out?" "Waited until they thought I'd been broken. Then I walked out during a dust storm when visibility was nothing. It took me 3 days to reach here." She looked at her hands. "I thought I'd be safe once I left. But the sheriff, he sends them supplies. Money. He helps them recruit. This town is next. They want to expand here." Jonas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Does anyone else know? Who would believe me? A woman rambling about forbidden touch and corrupt vessels?" She laughed bitterly. "They already think I'm cursed." Jonas picked up his hammer, turned it over in his hands. "I believe you," he said simply. Maeve looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not exactly, she was too exhausted for that. But maybe the beginning of something like it. Relief that she wasn't alone anymore. Over the next few days, Jonas became a fixture near the schoolhouse. He found reasons to be there, repairing the front steps, replacing rotted boards on the porch, fixing the rain gutter that had pulled away from the roofline. Small jobs that needed doing anyway, but also jobs that kept him close. He never pushed. Never demanded conversation. He was just there. Maeve would sit by the window sometimes, watching him work. At first she didn't speak, but gradually, in small increments, she began to open up. A sentence here. A memory there. Pieces of a story that had been locked inside her for too long. She told him about the storms that swept through the Covenant's compound, dust devils that turned the sky red and made breathing feel like drowning. She told him about the women who'd arrived seeking community and found prison instead. About the ledgers they kept, documenting tithes and transactions, treating people like inventory. She told him about the silence. That was the worst part, she said one afternoon, her voice drifting through the open window while Jonas measured a new board. Not the rules or the sermons or even the fear. It was the silence. The way we all stopped speaking to each other. Stopped looking at each other. They taught us that connection was dangerous, that trust was corruption. So we became ghosts living in the same house. Jonas paused his work. Silence can kill you just as sure as a bullet. Slower, though. Quieter. Nobody notices until you're already gone. He understood that. He'd lived it himself once, in a different way. There was a violence in being unseen, in having your truth dismissed before you even spoke it. You're speaking now, he said. Because you're listening. The comments sat between them, simple and profound. Meanwhile, the town continued to buzz with speculation. Sheriff Lyle had been making his rounds, stopping by businesses and homes, dropping suggestions that perhaps Jonas was being influenced by an unstable woman. Maybe his judgment was compromised. Those good people needed to be careful about who they showed sympathy to. The whispers grew louder. Some folks avoided the schoolhouse entirely now. Others made the sign against evil when they passed. Mrs. Patterson faced questions from concerned parents about whether it was safe for their children to return to lessons. But there were others, fewer, quieter, who brought food and left it on the schoolhouse steps without knocking. Who nodded at Jonas when they passed him in the street. Who were willing to wait and see before passing judgment. One evening, as the sun burned orange on the horizon, Maeve stepped outside for the first time since she'd arrived. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, breathing in air that didn't taste like fear. Jonas was gathering his tools, preparing to head home. I had a brother, she said suddenly. Before all this. Before the Covenant. He died in a mining accident when I was 17. I thought joining a faith community would help. That it would give me purpose, belonging. Instead, it gave me a different kind of death. She looked at Jonas directly. You asked me once why I never spoke until now. The truth is, silence was safer. When you speak, you give people a target. You make yourself visible. You risk being wrong, being dismissed, being hurt. Silence protects you. Does it? Jonas asked quietly. Maeve considered this. No. It protects the part of you that's already dying. But it kills everything else. Jonas nodded slowly, understanding the weight of that admission. I have something, Maeve said. She disappeared inside and returned with a folded stack of papers, edges worn and stained. I took these before I left. From Silas Lyle's office. I wasn't sure what I'd do with them, but I couldn't leave them there. She handed them to Jonas, careful not to let their fingers touch. He unfolded the pages and began to read. Names. Dates. Amount of money. Transfers of property. And at the bottom of several pages, 2 signatures, Silas Lyle and Burton Lyle. Brothers. Partners. Co-conspirators. Jonas looked up at Maeve. This is evidence. Evidence only matters if people care about the truth. Then we make them care. Jonas spent that night reading through every page Maeve had given him. By lamplight, the words took on a darker meaning. These weren't just records, they were a map of exploitation dressed up as righteousness. The ledger documented everything. Women who'd arrived at the covenant with property had signed it over to the church within months. Families who'd sent tithes believing they were supporting a spiritual community were funding something else entirely. There were notes about expansion plans, about identifying receptive towns where leadership could be influenced or replaced. Ash Hollow was circled on one of the pages. Written beside it, Sheriff Cooperative. Groundwork established. Jonas set the papers down and rubbed his eyes. This wasn't just about Maeve anymore. This was about every person in town who trusted their sheriff to protect them, not sell them out to his brother's twisted enterprise. The question was, how do you convince a town to see what it doesn't want to see? The next morning, Jonas went to old Samuel at the livery. Samuel had lived in Ash Hollow longer than anyone, had watched 3 sheriffs come and go, and had a reputation for being impossible to fool. "Need your opinion on something," Jonas said. He showed him the papers. Samuel read slowly, lips moving slightly, weathered fingers tracing the lines of text. When he finished, he looked up at Jonas with eyes that had gone hard. Burton Lyle's signature. On multiple pages. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. This woman. She's telling the truth. Every word. The old man folded the papers carefully and handed them back. People won't want to believe this. They'll fight it. Lyle's the law here. Questioning him means questioning everything they've accepted. I know. You do this, you make enemies. Permanent ones. I know that too. Samuel studied Jonas' face, then nodded once. Then I guess we better do it right. Town meeting. Tomorrow night. I'll spread the word. By evening, word had traveled. The blacksmith came by the schoolhouse, then the doctor, then Mrs. Patterson with several other women from the church committee. Jonas showed them the papers, explained what Maeve had told him, laid out the evidence piece by piece. Some believed immediately. Others were skeptical. A few were outright hostile, suggesting this was manipulation, that Jonas had been deceived, that he was causing division where there should be unity. But the signatures didn't lie. The handwriting was unmistakably Burton Lyle's. Sheriff Lyle heard about the meeting, of course. He showed up at the schoolhouse just after sunset, not bothering to knock. Jonas stepped outside to meet him. "You're making a serious mistake, Creed. I'm reading documents. That's all. Documents that woman stole. That makes them inadmissible, even if they weren't fabricated." Fabricated? Jonas kept his voice level. "That's your signature, isn't it?" Lyle's jaw tightened. "I've done consulting work for my brother's church. That's not a crime. What is a crime is theft, harboring a fugitive, and slander against a peace officer. She's not a fugitive. She left of her own free will. From a legal spiritual community that she'd committed herself to through a signed covenant. That makes her an oathbreaker at minimum." Jonas felt anger rising in his chest but kept it contained. Those oaths were extracted under coercion. The whole operation is built on control and fear. That's your interpretation. My interpretation is that you've been manipulated by an unstable woman with delusions and grudges. Lyle stepped closer. "Walk away from this. Tonight. Or I promise you'll regret it." "Is that a threat?" "It's a guarantee." From inside the schoolhouse, Maeve's voice carried through the window. "Let him threaten. Let everyone hear what protection really sounds like when it's threatened." Lyle's face went red. He turned and walked to his horse, mounted it with barely controlled fury. "Town meeting tomorrow," he called back. "I'll be there. And I'll make sure everyone understands exactly what's happening here. You're going to wish you'd stayed out of this, Carpenter." He rode off into the darkness, leaving Jonas standing in the dust. From the porch, Maeve appeared, still wrapped in her blanket. "He'll try to destroy you now." "Let him try," Jonas said quietly. You're not afraid. Jonas thought about that. I'm terrified. But I'm more afraid of what happens if nobody stands up. The town meeting was held in the largest space available, the church itself, ironic given the circumstances. By the time Jonas arrived, nearly every resident of Ash Hollow had packed inside. They sat in pews, stood along the walls, crowded in the doorway. The air was thick with body heat and tension. Sheriff Lyle stood at the front, positioned beneath the pulpit like he was about to deliver a sermon. He looked confident, cleaned up, badge polished and caught the lamplight. He'd prepared for this. Jonas carried the ledger tucked under his arm. Maeve had wanted to come, but he'd asked her to wait. This needed to start with facts, not emotion. Let the evidence speak first. Old Samuel called the meeting to order, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. We're here because serious accusations have been made. Everyone deserves to hear the full story before passing judgment. Lyle stepped forward immediately. I appreciate that, Samuel. Because what we're dealing with here is a dangerous situation. A woman arrived in our town carrying what appears to be some kind of contagion, not of the body, but of the mind. She's filled Jonas Creed's head with lies about my brother's church, about me, and about things she couldn't possibly understand. He paused, letting his words settle. My brother runs a legitimate faith community. They have strict rules, yes, but that's their right. This woman violated those rules, stole property, and fled. Now she's trying to justify her theft and betrayal by inventing stories about control and abuse. It's slander, pure and simple. Murmurs of agreement rippled through parts of the crowd. Jonas waited until Lyle finished, then stood. He didn't rush to the front. He walked calmly, deliberately, and set the ledger on the altar where everyone could see it. These are documents from the covenant of the pure word, he said. Written in Silas Lyle's hand and co-signed by Sheriff Burton Lyle. They detail financial transactions, property transfers, and expansion plans. I'm going to read some of them aloud. You can judge for yourself. He opened the first marked page. Entry dated March 14, received Rebecca Morrison. Widowed, 2 children, property in Stillwater valued at approximately $800. Covenant signed. Property transfer to be completed within 6 months under spiritual guidance clause. Jonas looked up. Rebecca Morrison arrived seeking community after her husband died. 6 months later, she no longer owned her own home. He turned to another page. Entry dated July 2. Sarah and Margaret Henley. Sisters. Arrived from St. Louis. Resisting sanctification protocols. Recommend isolation and reduced rations until compliance achieved. The room had gone very quiet. Jonas continued reading. Name after name. Women who'd arrived with resources and left with nothing. Families who'd sent tithes that were recorded as voluntary donations, but described in notes as required for continued good standing. And woven throughout it all, references to Sheriff Burton Lyle's assistance in securing legal documentation, in discouraging outside interference, in identifying potential recruits. When Jonas finished, he closed the ledger and faced the crowd. This is what Maeve Harlow escaped from. This is what she risked her life to expose. And this is what Sheriff Lyle has been helping to expand into Ash Hollow. Lyle's face had gone from confident to pale. Those documents are stolen. They're taken out of context. You can't possibly understand the spiritual complexities. I understand theft, interrupted the blacksmith, standing. I understand when someone's being robbed and told it's for their own good. I understand coercion, added Mrs. Patterson. I've seen what men do when they wrap control in religious language. Lyle looked around the room, searching for support and finding less of it than he'd expected. You're all making a mistake. My brother is a man of God. The church doors opened. Maeve stepped inside. She'd shed the blanket. Her dress was still worn and dusty, but she stood straight, shoulders back, chin lifted. She walked down the center aisle, and people moved aside for her. Not out of fear of contamination. Out of respect. She stopped in front of Sheriff Lyle. "Your power ends where our fear ends," she said, voice clear and steady. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Then she turned to Jonas and did something she hadn't done since arriving in Ash Hollow. She reached out her hand. Jonas understood what she was offering. Not a rescue. Not dependence. A choice. Partnership. Trust earned and freely given. He took her hand. Their fingers intertwined. No curse fell. No mark appeared. Just two people standing together in front of a town that had to decide what it believed. The silence in the church lasted only a moment before it shattered. Sheriff Lyle made a move toward his gun, but old Samuel was faster than anyone expected. The old man stepped forward, his own pistol drawn and aimed with the steadiness of someone who'd used one before. "Don't," Samuel said quietly. "Your time wearing that badge is over." Lyle's hand froze. He looked around the room at faces that had once deferred to him automatically, and now saw only suspicion and anger. The authority he'd counted on had evaporated like morning dew under a hard sun. "You can't do this," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "I'm the law here." "You were the law," said the blacksmith. "There's a difference." Mrs. Patterson stood. "I move that we vote to remove Burton Lyle as sheriff and appoint temporary leadership until the territorial governor can be notified." Hands went up across the room. Not everyone, some people still hesitated, still clung to the idea that challenging authority was more dangerous than tolerating corruption. But enough hands rose that the outcome was clear. Lyle looked at Jonas with pure hatred. "This isn't over." "Yeah," Jonas said. "It is." Two men from the crowd, the blacksmith and the livery owner's son, stepped forward to escort Lyle out. He didn't fight. He just walked out of the church with his shoulders rigid and his future in ruins. The meeting continued without him. They voted to send riders to the territorial capital with the ledger and a full report. They voted to send another group north to the Covenant's compound, not with violence, but with legal authority and witnesses, to document what was happening there and offer safe passage to anyone who wanted to leave. It wasn't a gunfight. It wasn't a showdown at high noon. It was a community deciding that they would no longer look away from the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Especially when the truth was uncomfortable. In the days that followed, things moved quickly. The territorial marshal arrived with deputies. Statements were taken. Burton Lyle was arrested on charges of conspiracy and fraud. Riders returned from the Covenant with 11 women who'd chosen to leave, plus documentation that corroborated everything Maeve had described. Silas Lyle was arrested too. His church was dissolved, its assets frozen pending investigation. The women who'd escaped stayed in Ash Hollow temporarily, boarding with families who offered space. Some would move on eventually, returning to families they'd left or starting fresh somewhere new. Others would stay, finding that the small, dusty town had more heart than they'd expected. Maeve chose to stay. She found work helping Mrs. Patterson at the schoolhouse, teaching reading and arithmetic to children who looked at her with curiosity but not fear. The story of what had happened spread, but it evolved in the telling. She wasn't the cursed woman anymore. She was the one who'd been brave enough to run. Brave enough to speak. Jonas continued his work, building the new town meeting hall that Ash Hollow had voted to construct. It would be a place where decisions got made in the open, where voices could be heard without fear of retribution. Maeve visited the construction site most days. She'd bring water, and they'd talk, about the progress on the building, about plans for the town's future, about small things that didn't carry the weight of trauma. One afternoon, as Jonas was fitting the final beam into place on the meeting hall's roof, Maeve climbed the ladder to stand beside him. It's beautiful, she said, looking out over Ash Hollow from that height. The town didn't look like much, still dusty, still worn, still rough around the edges. But there was something different about it now. Something that felt like possibility. It's just a building, Jonas said. No. It's proof that things can be built instead of broken. That people can choose something better. Jonas looked at her, at the woman who'd collapsed in the dust just weeks ago, now standing straight and steady and unafraid. You found your voice, he said. You helped me remember I had one. They stood together on that rooftop, two people who'd learned that courage doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply refuses to stay silent. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. Below them, Ash Hollow continued its daily rhythm, imperfect, complicated, but awake in a way it hadn't been before. The town had learned something essential, that the most dangerous lies are the ones you tell yourself about who deserves to be heard. Maeve smiled, feeling the wind on her face, no longer carrying the weight of forbidden touch or manufactured shame. Just wind. Just freedom. Just the beginning of a story she'd get to write herself. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales from the Wild West. These stories matter because they remind us that courage isn't always loud, sometimes it's just one person deciding to stand up when everyone else looks away. Drop a comment and let me know which part hit you the hardest. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.